Okay, well, maybe we've stabilized and, I'm excited to have Brett here. The paper he's gonna be sharing with us was one that I actually really enjoyed. He sent it on over to me, and it's common nonsense about passwords. And if I can just for a moment mention, I have a really long interest in things we believe that we shouldn't believe, I'm excited to see some of you here. Hosea is a co-author on a new book, Myth, if I'm going to get the title right here, Myths and Misconceptions in Cybersecurity. And so I think this is actually a really cool topic because, from my perspective, grounding what we're doing in empirical evidence about the world is so crucial in the world of public health that I love seeing these approaches as we think about what cyber public health can be. And with that, I think I should stop and turn it over to Brett.
Sure. Thanks, Adam. So let me try to share screens. I got some slides. Sure this works. All right. Are you guys seeing the slides? That working? Cool. I'm just moving you all out of the middle of my screen so I don't have to, no offense, but so I'm not staring at you as I'm looking and realizing what my slides are. I'm going to open it up a little bit more. There we go. Awesome. Well, again, thanks, Yuri and Adam, for inviting me into your community. I don't know anybody else on the call, and I'm trying to think about how Adam and I originally met, and I can't recall. It was on some sort of exchange, some kind of random exchange on an Ostrom workshop or something, and I was like, "Oh, that sounds interesting." And he invited me to come out to one of these, and I came and I sent my paper, and then Adam gave me all these awesome comments on the on this case study I'm going to talk to you guys about. And so it's a real pleasure to be here with you all to sort of talk about this project. I'm excited to talk with you about it. My co-author, Alexandra, who's currently a law student at Duke Law School. She couldn't make it, but she's here in spirit. Since time is short, I'm going to sort of just jump in. I kind of look forward to the Q&A with all of you. So I want to let me start by saying that I'm not a security expert. So you might be wondering how I became interested in the project. Well, I really started with a focus on common sense. So initially in the Reengineering Humanity book from back in 2018, something I'm still doing a ton of work building off of. But back in that book, we considered common sense to be an important capability essential to human flourishing that's possibly put at risk in our modern techno-social environment. Okay, so we have a reverse Turing test discussion. We've developed this idea of a reverse Turing test focusing on common sense and a whole bunch of stuff. So there's a whole discussion of common sense in that Reengineering Humanity book. And then I saw a connection between that work and the work I've been doing for about 20 years on governing knowledge commons, sort of building on Ostrom's work and, in association with the workshop. I've been doing stuff on governing knowledge commons, a whole book series and whatnot. And so I wrote a chapter, this chapter that you see on the slide, the Common Sense Commons chapter, for the governing the markets as knowledge commons book. And in that chapter, which is really focused on commonsensical social norms, I gave a few examples of privacy-related commonsensical social norms, like wear clothing in public. But also some security-related commonsensical social norms, like be smart about passwords. And there's others up there on the screen. I'm not going to go through them; they're not terribly relevant for this talk. But so I offered a very brief discussion about what being smart about passwords could mean, and what common sense might suggest about choosing passwords, and about the all too common practice of requiring people to periodically change them. And this is sort of concluding the remarks at the end of a case study that really wasn't focused on passwords or security in particular. It was just sort of an illustration. And then a little bit later, there's another Knowledge Commons book, big Knowledge Commons project on governing misinformation in Knowledge Commons. And there's a series of case studies in this book. And there was a workshop and a conference, and this book isn't quite yet out. It's in the sort of editing stages. And so I was asked to do a case study focused on misinformation for an interdisciplinary conference. And I started to think, you know what, maybe there's a kind of misinformation, a problem associated with password security that I wanted to investigate and learn more about and think more deeply about. And that's really the genesis of this project. And so creating and managing passwords is familiar to most of us. We use passwords on computing devices every day to access a whole kinds of different things that we use. We have to authenticate ourselves by logging in and using a username and password. So password creation and management practices require knowledge that might seem commonsensical, yet common sense about passwords and security is often misleading nonsense. In the sense that many lay people hold completely incorrect beliefs about what makes a password secure, about the nature and origin of security threats, about the kinds of practices, everyday life practices that compromise or conversely strengthen security. And so while the gap between lay and expert knowledge about password security is actually rather well documented in the literature, less well understood, I think, is why the gap persists. What are the origins of incorrect beliefs and misguided security practices? And so in this paper, what we try to examine this gap and identify what we call in the Knowledge Commons world, I guess, knowledge governance dilemmas that might help explain the persistence. And so we use this Governing Knowledge Commons framework, which is a systematic interdisciplinary framework for doing case study research and organizing the kinds of questions one might ask, whether in interviews or in doing lit reviews or doing different kinds of things, to structure the study, frame the conceptual and empirical questions to investigate. And because the security knowledge ecosystem is so incredibly complex, of which I think most of you are much more familiar than I, we just decided to focus on password security. And people often ask, like, why passwords? I mean, we don't even need passwords anymore. Multi-factor authenticate. Well, we're still using passwords. People use passwords all the time, constantly. We'll probably be using them for the foreseeable future. Lots of people do. But regardless, I'm as interested in the knowledge aspects of the password security and what we know about and how the knowledge gap persists and how misinformation is created and persistent in this area. Even if in 3 years passwords go away, the case study is still very useful, as I'll try to summarize it as we get to the end, about understanding other kinds of misinformation problems, of other kinds of cybersecurity problems. But we've got a decent body of evidence in an area that we can study that focuses on passwords in particular. So I think it's both useful to do this for the sake of password security, because it tells us something about how to do security in day-to-day, everyday life for billions of people, to be honest. And at the same time, even if passwords go away and get replaced with a different technology, a different means of authentication, we nonetheless will still learn something quite useful. We could learn something quite useful by studying this example. So I won't go into all the details, but a couple things about at the outset. Like, we initially framed the study in terms of two knowledge communities, like experts and lay people, and we kind of figured out, and we didn't think of it this way in the very beginning, but we learned to think of it this way, as there being another sort of intermediary layer of practitioners and professionals who are not really necessarily qualified to think of as lay people, but they're also not necessarily members of that expert research community that are sort of engaging in the scholarly research, and their main focus is on security. And so this really came out really just in the interviews mostly, where the importance of this intermediary layer kind of surfaced. The methods we use for this paper there's two primary methods: just systematic literature review, and then semi-structured interviews of password security experts. And like details about all that are both in the paper. I'm happy to share, but they're also going to be up in more detail. All the questions and stuff will be in an open archive data portal that will be online. So I won't dwell on that stuff. So I think everyone here is probably familiar with this. This is anytime I talk about password security, the first thing people do is say, "Oh, well, you must know about this. You have to use this slide." So here's the slide, and I have to use it. So as you all know, passwords are knowledge-based means for authentication. There are other means that we can use to authenticate, but knowledge of a password serves as a proxy for identification in a system designed to control access to resources or systems. And so the questions that we're interested in are, so how do people use passwords? What do people believe about passwords when they're using them? Do they understand password strengths, security threats, and their consequences? These are the kinds of questions we were looking at when we were doing our literature review. And here are some of the common practices and beliefs among users that surfaced in the literature review. I should note that a lot of times the literature is not focused on these questions, but these are the kinds of observations that you're finding almost as one-offs, or as oh, and by the way, like this is what we kept repeatedly seeing in our subject. So like across the different the literature that we reviewed, here are the kinds of practices and beliefs. I'm not going to just read them off the slide to you. You can all see them. And many of these are going to be quite familiar, right? Things that people tend to do, and things that people tend to believe. And the things that people often believe, the misconceptions about password security tend to persist despite growing public awareness of security threats. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And I'm going to highlight in the next slide the ones that surface most often and prominently in the literature and in our interviews. And so here are some of the basic reasons for persistent misconceptions about password security. Now, of course, passwords have become a recurring aspect of everyday life in our digital network world because of the many different devices and online accounts we use daily that require authentication. So a 2020 study by NordPass revealed that I think the average user has about 100 passwords. Lay people tend to have an incomplete understanding of the nature and variety. So that's one factor, right? It's just a large number that we have to manage means it's very difficult to grapple with what's going on with passwords. Lay people tend to have an incomplete understanding of the nature and the variety of password security threats. So I think every single expert we talked to emphasized the importance of recognizing that there are many different threats, and yet, what lay people tend to think about when they think about the threats are guessing a password guessing, which makes sense. Sort of password guessing is kind of as simple as it sounds. It can be understood a certain way by lay people, right? You think of just a person sitting there and guessing your password, trying to guess your password. So it's a threat model most people can understand. Part of the problem with having a simple threat model they can understand is that threat model is actually much more complicated than the simple story about the model is, right? So people tend to think of it a certain way, and yet it can get really, as you all know, it can get much more complicated and correspondingly more difficult as it gets more complicated for lay people to actually understand the nature of the threat. And it can happen in different dimensions, right? So if you think about attacker using different kinds of tools, those tools might be surveillance tools, right? So it's hard to understand a guessing threat when the person who's doing the attacker is using a surveillance tool to collect information about likely passwords, right? From which they can infer or even just learn what you're likely to have as a password. It's harder for lay people to understand the threat when they have to think about that tool as well and how sophisticated those tools can be and when they're used and so on. Or computational tools, just the idea of a password guessing algorithm and how it works and what its capabilities are, again, complicates the story, but the threat model, and also makes it harder for a layperson to fully grapple with. It also can be difficult to appreciate nuanced differences between, and there's a bunch of attacks that are have a specified target or are undirected or online versus offline, and there's sort of different variations just thinking about guessing attacks. But of course, to make things more complicated, especially for lay people, many threats to password protected resources don't involve password guessing at all. Now, we discussed these in the paper, I think for time, because I want to get to Q&A, and I know that I talk a lot on these kinds of things. I'm going to skip over that, but we can go back and sort of identify them if people like to. I'd like to focus on how. So incomplete understanding the nature of the threats. Misunderstanding the threats can strengthen or exacerbate incorrect beliefs or poor security practices. But I want to focus on this last one, which is was how lay people especially, learn about password security. Right? How do we actually, where do our beliefs come from? Where do lay people's beliefs originate? Most of the experts we interviewed suggest that people learn through their everyday experiences with passwords, supporting, I think, if not confirming, our hypothesis from the outset that password knowledge is often in the realm of everyday common sense knowledge. It's the kind of knowledge you learn from your everyday experiences, and it's this kind of social knowledge that you learn often in communication with others or by virtue of how you're interacting in a social context. So people engage with password creation regularly, encountering password composition rules and password security meters. And so in addition to the instrumental function of those tools, that is creating a secure password, these tools also serve an important, we argue in the paper, overlooked, underappreciated pedagogical function, which is to teach users about password security. This is what we call, and you see a little diagram at the bottom of the screen in the GKC Governing Knowledge Commons world. This is sort of the model for the framework that there's different questions we use to sort of analyze things over time. This in a different talk, I would spend 25 minutes explaining this model. Don't worry about it right now. What matters is we can use this to identify social dilemmas and governance challenges. We identify an action arena that we want to study over time. And in this case, one action arena is this password creation action arena, where there's situations people engage in regularly and they're interacting with these tools. There are other action arenas that we talk briefly about in the paper, but we don't dig into as much. All right, so password security. So thinking about password security creation, the tools that I just mentioned, right, the password creation, the password composition, unfortunately, these tools can easily mislead and teach the wrong lessons. Like that's one of the things that comes out of this study, right? So consider this following stylized example we raised during all of our interviews and sort of asked our experts about. So suppose, Jeremy has to create a new password. He encounters a typical password creation interface. That is a text box to enter characters, a set of password composition rules displayed prominently to one side, a password strength meter that updates the color, let's say red, yellow, and green, with each new character displayed prominently on the other side. And again, this is just a stylized typo to sort of set things up for a conversation. Step one, Jeremy begins by typing the following characters, basically Jeremy, types the name, capital J. The security meter remains red. Step two, the Jeremy continues by adding the following character, the number 1. The security meter turns yellow. Step 3, Jeremy continues by adding the following character, an exclamation point. The security meter turns green. And what I'm doing right now, every interview, we basically talk through the stylized typo and then had a set of questions about, okay, what might Jeremy learn from this process? So here's just sort of an actual use of this, right? So here's a password strength test, password strength meter. You enter in Jeremy into this, and it remains red. Jeremy 1, in this case, it actually stays red. It goes Jeremy 1 exclamation point. Ooh, it's green. It turns, safe, sound, you're good to go, of course. And so the question we had for our interviewees was, what might Jeremy learn from this experience? Right, this everyday experience we have engaging with these tools. They create passwords for us, but they also teach us something. What do they teach? What might you learn? What have the tools taught him about password security? Well, there's various ways in which the tools could teach the wrong lessons. In other words, a kind of misinformation about password security. And we identified 3 different kinds of knowledge dilemma or misinformation problems with this simple example, right? So first, the security meter implies marginal security improvements that might not be genuine or meaningful improvements, right? So adding a single number or a symbol at the end of a common name does not substantially improve the strength of the password, right? So in the specific example, Jeremy 1 exclamation point are all relatively weak password. The marginal difference between the first 2 passwords is negligible. The third is an improvement, but it's not substantial, right? Okay, so the marginal difference is that there's a lesson learned that is wrong as it goes from in the hypothetical, by the way, as it goes from weak to medium or moderate, I think we said, and then strong. Second, in more absolute terms, the security meter suggests that Jeremy one exclamation point is in fact a strong password. It's not, right? Now, this is an incredibly important source of consequential misinformation, right? So Jeremy, like most lay people, is likely to trust the digital tool, rely on its advice and the weak password, and go no further to create an even stronger password or to learn more about password security. Right? You're going to stop there, be done. How can this possibly occur? Well, you may be familiar with this, but in practice, security meters are based on compliance with password composition rules. And what that essentially means is that strength depends on checking a series of boxes, right? The number of characters or different character classes, having enough characters, the length of the password, 8, 12, whatever, and not being on a blacklist of already known common passwords. These are the kinds of things that help determine what you're going to see. That's how it can be so that you have a tool that doesn't pay attention to the actual pedagogical functions that I've sort of just suggested, but just sort of it's about checking certain boxes, meeting a checklist. So the third thing, besides the marginal lessons of step to step and the absolute and consequential misinformation to Jeremy sticking with a weak password and thinking it's strong when it's weak, is like, besides the attempt to create the specific password, right? There's sort of the more longitudinal effect, the lessons learned about password security that Jerry might carry to his next password creation experience, or that he may relate to others as he communicates about what a strong password is. It doesn't mean that he says, hey, by the way, my password is Jeremy one exclamation point. It just means when he's talking to someone else about how to create a strong password, he can very well communicate the wrong and perpetuate the misinformation. But again, we know very little about these kinds of effects. No one seems to study them, and they're hard to sort of capture, but I think they're worth recognizing. Here's some ChatGPT fun. If ChatGPT happens to get this wrong too. Again, ChatGPT tells us that Jeremy one exclamation point is moderately strong. It's not. It's weak. Right? Misinformation again. But the reason why ChatGPT supplies this misinformation is different from the reason why you get it from the password meter itself. We can talk about that if people are interested. It doesn't really matter. I was just trying to have some fun. But there is a hint of teaching. This is what's kind of interesting, right? So if you keep reading, and I ran this same query like 5 times to get different results, and some of them teach better. They all reach the wrong result. They all say it's strong or moderately strong, and then the but is what's a hint of how you could improve the tools, right? The meters themselves. So security meters could be designed to be better pedagogical tools. So for example, when Jeremy added the numeral 1 to his name, the tool could suggest more secure alternatives, say moving the number in the middle of the word of the name rather than at the end. And it could explain, right? Regardless of whether Jeremy chose the option, he could learn why it would be more secure with just a little bit of explanation. Right? So conversational prompts during password creation, for example, could teach while also nudging people towards stronger passwords. Arvind Narayanan had suggested, after discussing this stylized example, and I'll quote, well-designed password meters can both help users create strong passwords and teach them what makes a stronger password. And I think that's something that's one of the lessons from this study. Another common experience lay people have is, of course, is with forgetting passwords, right? So people often forget a password and then engage a different set of tools, password recovery tools, and, responding, for example, to a set of security questions, secret questions, challenge questions, they're called different things in the literature, that substitute for a password as a knowledge-based means for authentication. And again, these kinds of tools also have instrumental and pedagogical functions, and we can kind of go through and sort of, draw out those implications if we wish, but for time, I think I'm going to skip this action arena and just note that it exists, and it's one that might be interesting to study. We focus mostly on the password creation. Let me take a quick sip, hold on. All right, so we also then, that's part of the study. The other thing we talk a bit about, both through the lit review and the interviews, we want to explain what we learned about expert knowledge and how it's changed over the past few decades to sort of help explain this gap. In the early days of computing and networking, password security experts mostly were academic researchers with a certain kind of expertise, right? Computer science, math, and engineering. The experts thought about password security primarily as a mathematical problem, right? The security experts mostly worried about a certain kind of attack, automated guessing attacks, right? Guessing attacks leveraging computational tools. The offense and defense of password security, in other words, was at its core a computational problem. And as such, expert knowledge about password security was heavily based on the mathematical theory of computation. And it led to certain prescriptions, namely that users should create sufficiently strong passwords to withstand an attack. So expert knowledge about password security shifted dramatically, and this came up in all the interviews, and you can actually see it sort of as you read the literature and who's cross-citing and stuff. It's interesting. Everyone knows about it. It seems like in the field, everybody sort of knows this, but it was interesting to sort of see it in the literature and then hear it from all of the experts. But there's this dramatic shift. According to some of the interviews during the 2000s, significant changes in expert knowledge emerged as knowledge grounded in theory failed to match reality or everyday life experience. There's sort of this empirical turn. So there are a couple of reasons this happens. So one is there's major changes in the technological environment itself, right? So over the past few decades, as you all know, digital network computing technologies evolved considerably, diffused widely. And what that means is the number of users and number of accounts each user must manage grew incredibly. So password protected resources become part of everyday life experience for billions of people, right? That shift dramatically expands the attack surface where offense and defense of password security plays out. And as a result, fundamentally alters the epistemic demands on password security experts. So first, despite reasonable consensus among experts about what constitutes a strong password, and you can talk about complexity and entropy and all that, although that changes, people nonetheless often chose and still choose terribly weak passwords, right? So you get leaked data sets of millions of actual passwords, the rocku.com database being a famous one. And it confirmed what had been sort of commonsensical, right? Lay people were unable to keep up with the computational arms race, an ever-growing number of passwords, and so they just defaulted to weak but memorable passwords and reused such passwords across different accounts, right? So what you end up seeing is a shift in focus among security researchers towards the needs and capabilities of actual human beings involved in authentication processes, right? So human factors and usability matter. It's no longer just a computational problem, mathematics or computational problem. At the same time, sort of guessing attacks become more sophisticated and varied. Beyond guessing attacks, the threats multiply, become more varied, and they hybridize. The emergence of new threats and their successful exploitation force the expert community to confront the notion that password security is not just about math, a math problem solved with strong passwords. Instead, it's this multifaceted, complex problem that has to involve recognition of the fallibilities of both humans and organizations. So the community evolves and it becomes more inclusive of people from experts from different disciplines, like the usability security community grows substantially. It has more of an emphasis on empirical evidence and testing theory in practice, like recommendations and what's going on in the field. And then the last thing that's at the bottom of the slide is that you get the recognition of the importance of the intermediate layer professionals and practitioners who are actually sort of mediating between the expert research community and the lay people, both in terms of like knowledge, but also in terms of just the various technologies and tools that they're deploying. How am I doing? I should check time. I didn't even realize. Okay, I think I'm okay, right? A few more minutes. Okay, so so one of the ways we wanted to look at, so we started looking at this intermediate layer between like the professionals and practitioners and the roles they play. There's this kind of disconnect between security experts, their views and recommended practices, and the actual practices of professionals and practitioners. And so one example of that is a recent paper that found that only 13% of 120 of the most popular websites actually followed established best practices, meaning practices supported by research in security and usability. Not that there's an absolute consensus, but sort of what the current set of recommended practices are. We spend a little bit of time in the paper using NIST, the NIST example as an illustration. And this is probably something everyone on the call may be familiar with, but I'll just do it real quickly. In 2003, NIST released the NIST Special Publication 800-63, where they advise users to protect and secure accounts by creating passwords in a certain way. And the focus here really is on changing their passwords regularly, right? Among other things, the prescription to change your password regularly is based on a math theory mindset concerned with managing the risk associated with a data breach that could compromise an organization's passwords, right? So think think about if you guys are at universities, think about a university often has periodic changes of your password. The theory behind that is if there is a data breach and passwords are leaked, that at least if you have a regular periodic, by the time there's those leaked data, the leaked data is exploited, your password will have been changed. That's the theory behind mitigating the risk. Of course, there's significant problems with that as an approach to dealing with that risk. And the basic, this was all recognized by the community. And so by 2017, NIST sort of reverses course. And in this publication, they established new guidelines. And one of the recommendations is simply that organizations should no longer require password expiration unless there's evidence of a compromise. Right. So you should not. The standard set by NIST at this stage is for organizations don't periodically require people to change their password. And the reason why is pretty straightforward. If you look at the empirical evidence of human behavior, when they're asked to regularly, periodically update their passwords, because I don't know how many of you have done this. If you talk to anybody who has had to do this and you talk to them about it, you say, well, whatever your password might be, and you're asked to repeat it, what do you tend to do? And you'll find out pretty quickly that most people, most of the time, make a slight iteration. They append a number, for example, to their password, and then they up it one. They go from Jeremy 1 exclamation point to Jeremy 2 exclamation point to Jeremy 3 exclamation point. There's a predictable pattern of the way that you will replace an existing password with a new password, right? And that predictable pattern actually makes it easier for the person who may have breached, hacked and gotten access to the set of passwords. It's even easier to make a prediction because you can predict based on the pattern what people are likely to do. And so, this reverses course on this, right? Here's the puzzle, I think I still don't have an answer to this, and this could be a follow-on project for someone to undertake, and I don't know how hard it would be. NIST, what's the rate of compliance with the 2000, what's the state of affairs in 2023 in terms of organizational and business practices? I mean, how many organizations still require periodic? I mean, how many have not adjusted their practices to sort of updated them to comply with the NIST standard? And my understanding, completely anecdotally, but also, to be honest, we asked the experts about this, and most of them said, I don't know of any study on this. But my understanding is that most organizations, certainly most universities, still do this. I think Cormac, who's at Microsoft Research, had to fight a political battle to internally to get the change to happen. And so it's an interesting sort of thing to explore. We do it briefly, why there's this lag and why it's hard to get compliance with this new standard. But I think it's an interesting governance question that is worth studying further. So I've got 2 more slides and I'll wrap up. So one of the themes that surfaced repeatedly in our interviews is this idea of a disconnect between expert knowledge and professional knowledge and practice. And then this idea that may lead to a sort of trickle down effect with regard to layperson misunderstanding. At least it's part of a lack of a lag in knowledge flows between experts and professionals. And there's a number of reasons why this might be the case. I'll mention just a couple of the reasons. Could include the rapidly changing technological environment, different competing incentives between the expert and professional community, and there's 3 kind of concerns we raise near the end of the paper. First is that professionals responsible for password security and the business practices, as well as interface design, may perceive security as one of many different competing considerations. business, technical, so on and so forth. Second, and some of these are related, second, a compliance mindset might lead professionals to ignore academic security research and instead rely on security standards that are set by insurance companies, auditors, and other industry actors, or even government. Like until those actors change things, that really doesn't, we're not going to pay attention to what the experts are saying. It takes too much work, or it's hard to know, or we're not, at least we're not obligated to in terms of our compliance processes. And then finally, professionals may, this came up in some of the interviews, we didn't see it elsewhere, but some of the interviewees suggested that professionals may be overconfident and inaccurately see themselves as security experts and sufficiently up to date on security, when in fact they've got multiple responsibilities, and the last security training they've really had is when they were an undergraduate or when they were in university a number of years ago, and like staying up to date has become a difficult task. So let me wrap up. So this is some of the things we think are interesting to explore going forward about this intermediary gap. I have to say that because we didn't start out thinking about this professional practitioner intermediary layer, we didn't go into it. We weren't able to really fully explore it. Like the exploration of that layer was limited to what we talked about during the interviews, and then sort of some follow-on kinds of research, but it really wasn't as deep as I think it really could or should be. Just admit that from the outset, right at this point. In conclusion, like I think there are lessons for other misinformation problems, like the value of studying password security misinformation or common nonsense about password security and the kinds of things we've been talking about, is I think it's actually relevant to other kinds of misinformation problems. Now, of course, in some ways it's distinguishable from fake news and propaganda types that depend upon trolls, bots, or others who are deliberately polluting knowledge networks. And yet there are some interesting similarities, right? I mean, especially with respect to how people learn about and from digital tools that they regularly use, as well as how outdated information is sort of perpetuated. The study examined different epistemic dynamics and dilemmas that might require different forms of governance, but again, unfortunately, we were unable to fully explore the governance institutions within and between the different communities of the different layers that I've mentioned. I think this would be possibly an interesting topic for future research. Be interested to see if you guys think likewise. And then I've listed on there a couple of other future research projects that certainly if people on this call or these are like ring out to your area of interest, or you've got grad students who are interested in this kind of stuff, like I think there's a number of interesting things that might sort of flow from this project as sort of follow-on work. I won't read them to you. They're on the slide, and we can kind of just sort of stop there and move into Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And, let's open the floor for questions. I have a couple, but I don't want to dominate here. Okay, maybe I will dominate and someone else can ask the next question. I think the misinformation framing is really fascinating. And I'm curious how you think it might differ from other fields. And I'll give you sort of a little trivial example. I was reading on Mastodon yesterday, a lawyer who was criticizing, I'll use the word criticizing, someone who put in the copyright notice of their book, you may not loan this book to a friend, it's copyrighted material. Right. And yeah. And here we see misinformation in the legal field, right? That people have these misunderstandings of what copyright could or couldn't do for them. And so I'm wondering, how do you think this problem of misinformation in cybersecurity differs from other fields and professional knowledge in other fields?
That's a great question. I'm not sure it necessarily does differ, right? And it may very well be the case that there are in many fields outside of cybersecurity, there is a expert to professional practitioner to layperson sort of structure to the knowledge ecosystem. and that there is the information, like the lag in communication from experts to professionals exists, and that there's competing incentives. I mean, it may very well be that the structure that leads to these kinds of gaps and types of information, misinformation problems exist elsewhere. I mean, I actually strongly suspect that that is the case, and that's kind of one of the points why I think that regardless of whether passwords go away in a year or 2 years or 5 years because they're technologically unnecessary, replaced, substituted for by better authentication mechanisms, it doesn't really matter to me. At least what matters to me is to study the information flows and learn about the governance processes that there's demand for governance. And it may be that in some areas, domains, there are governance institutions that work, that help resolve these kinds of misinformation problems so that they're less impactful. And in others, they're not. At this stage, I think like you can look at the role of NIST, for example. In some ways, seems like it's surprising to me that NIST isn't more influential on the practitioner community. And the question that would be interesting is why? Like, is there a missing governance institution? Is there something about there's a lag with the insurance industry, for example, like updating their compliance requirements so that the professional community, wherein maybe in other fields, the sort of the governmental or standard setting body that sort of takes expert knowledge and translates it into a sort of a practical standard is more effective, maybe more effective. Or maybe NIST is more effective in other areas and less effective in security. I'm not quite sure.
Okay. Audrey, do you want to jump in on this or a different topic?
No, it was a bit like this. I'm not sure I'm going to talk with the language that has been used, but what really struck me is that gap you identified, which has actually been identified for a long time, but never presented under that angle. So usually the gap between the cybersecurity professionals and the, if you like, software developers or software programmers who are not cybersecurity, that is usually presented as, I would say, the cost of convenience or the economic cost. So, the famous penetrate first the market, patch later. So that's for vulnerability, but for password, it's a bit the same policy, that notion that, we'll forget about the password, we'll deal with the password later on. And we set it up as default with, not many requirements, or the default requirements are actually not the most efficient because you're stuck with 8 characters and you've got to put those special characters into it, and obviously nobody ever remembers them, so you end up ever resetting your password every time, or you don't bother, you write it down, and it's obviously the worst practice possible. So I was wondering if the literature on that needs to be reviewed with that other angle, that cyber belief angle, where we need to revisit that very known literature. I mean, I can think in the EU of 2 reports and look at it from that point of view. And then I think, in a way, I know it sounds probably not very structured as a thought, but I think that links with the insurance bit. And this is where we may want to take an analogy that has nothing to do with cyber, but car accidents. Okay, let's face it. The reason we have airbags, we've got a main brake, we've got seat belts, it's because government got the stats from hospitals. They realized that people who had an accident were usually ending up dead or with serious injuries, and it was the state having to pick up the bill. So what did they do? They just put some requirements, and that obliged the insurances to react to that. And the system worked by effectively making insurances mandatory and insurers had to pick up the bill rather than the government. I mean, roughly that was the movement for cars, and that may be something also that could be looked at, because on the EU side, it's quite an interesting one. They got this Cybersecurity Resilience Act, and what they want to do is oblige manufacturers to have a certain level of security, so they can't release their product without reaching us. But it's quite unclear about how they're going to achieve that. So, if I take the password example, they're not going to say you need 25 characters that are lowercase and 4 words into this, and it doesn't have to, you don't have to put uppercase or special characters into it or numbers and so on. They can't say that because that is too technical, so it's not tech neutral enough. It wouldn't be able to adapt to evolutions on cybersecurity. But then it means that they adopt a vocabulary that is really vague, and we never know where are those state-of-the-art, system or security practices, and therefore it's left to the interpretation. So is there something else that needs to be thought through as like an intermediary or something that needs to be in between the cyber belief? So I can't remember your lovely slide, Adam, about, the 4 steps. You had the belief and you have the thing that you presented last time. But is it something in there that needs to be looked at again, and starting with this work on the password? Because I just got the sense that we talked a lot of things about for 30 years and we haven't moved on because we haven't found the right angle. So is it that the cyber health thing will be able to shift the dynamics? I shut up.
So I think the question about the relationship between this and the cyber belief work is one that I'm really interested in pursuing. I'm glad you brought it up. And I also noticed that Hosea has had his hand up for a little bit and want to hand the mic over.
Sure, thanks. This was a really interesting viewpoint. I appreciate it a lot. Having just finished a book on cyber myths and misconceptions, I thought it was added things that we hadn't considered. I am strongly in agreement that users should be more educated, that they should be able to make more informed choices. And so, as you talked about, like better password managers might do that. But as you were talking, I actually got to arguing in my own head about whether users should have the right to pick a bad password. And I appreciate the sort of externalities of maybe that gives an attacker access to compromise more people if they can get into the system. But insofar as like, I don't care about my social media or my bank for some reason, should I be given the choice to say like, yep, I'm smart, I understand the risk, and I'm going to accept that risk? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, a right to choose your own password. To hell with the consequences. I guess, I mean, there are lots of spillover external effects that you might be concerned with. Not just, so there's external effects to yourself, right? They're like your future self, or like other things about you that you may not have fully taken into account when you make the choice. That's one thing. And whether like you should be nudged or required to actually choose stronger passwords because it's in that's sort of a paternalistic sort of push on it. But then there's also the concern about you're actually compromising others, right? Other people can be compromised because you choose a weak password. So this is just a general, like, approach to thinking about what how liberal or paternalistic or whatever you want to sort of where you get to go. I don't know why in particular passwords would be in the realm of something we would elevate your autonomy interest and think that, oh yeah, you think that's where your autonomy really stands out. But I don't know. I mean, I want to hear more about why the choice of a password is something we would think of as an expression of your autonomy in a way that we'd want to protect it at the risk of putting other people at risk.
It's not wholly unlike health, right? We have had this debate as a global conversation, right, about my choices impacting other people and whether I have autonomy in that. And different people have made wildly different choices. And I think passwords bear some similarity. It's not 100%.
So if I can jump in with an element of autonomy just to feed this part of the conversation, one of my banks for my business insists that I change my password every 60 days. And I spent a good 10 minutes changing it on their website, then changing it in the app, then changing it in QuickBooks so everything remains integrated. And they've also, for the past 6 months, had mandatory multi-factor authentication. And so my time and energy is spent. And so to the question of autonomy, right, they're spending my time to make me use a better password. Maybe I should have a little more choice other than firing the bank, which is what I literally did, because it just got too annoying for me. But that's an autonomy argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think there are there are costs that you are forced to bear when you're interacting, but there's lots of costs besides like how onerous the password security policy is. I mean, you can say the same thing about all kinds of privacy considerations or how much data you've got to provide about yourself in order to participate on a this or that service. And we can kind of get it. Well, there's all of these impositions on our autonomy. But and if the security measure being imposed upon you is in fact a good one, that's one thing, right? If in fact it's like we are requiring you to engage in bad security practices, like renewing your password when there hasn't been a compromise, just because we've got a policy of periodic replacements, then you've got then you've got a different kind of concern. I mean, I think the autonomy thing is interesting. It's also like from just a pragmatic standpoint. This is something Cormac Hurley sort of suggested a lot, and both of it is early writing, but also in interviews. Is like actually users are not as necessarily as dumb as you think. Like they engage in common sense all the time, and one of the commonsensical things to do with managing your passwords is for low value accounts to use a simple, easy to remember password and to reuse it across a bunch of low value accounts, so long as you're good at partitioning between the low value and the high value accounts, the ones that need to be secure. And he makes that point. But again, like to enable you to exercise your autonomy and make decisions that are in your interest, I think what kind of there is you need some institutional support. You need actual tools like password creation. The tools and infrastructure for security actually have to be enabling you to exercise your autonomy effectively. If they're forcing you into making bad security choices, or they're disabling your ability to exercise your autonomy in a way that you can be secure, then you've got a identifiable problem. For which the question is, should there be government intervention, or should we sort of try to figure out how to tweak the system some other way?
Oh, Jennifer puts a question into the chat here.
I can pull it.
Maybe we'll take that as a last question so we can let people go by 4 p.m. Eastern.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is I don't know, but it's that's kind of the empirical question, I think, for a research, like a good empirical project would be to sort of look at the practices of, let's say we pick universities, or we pick Fortune 500 companies, or companies of a certain size or something, just to have a selection but figure out who you're going to study and how you're going to select from it. And then you sort of just survey initially just what are their practices with regard to, and then pick a password policy component of a password policy security that we care about. Like, for example, any one of the 3 action arenas I mentioned, right? And then look at what they're doing. First of all, what are the practices? Are they? And then you can sort of evaluate whether they're up to par with current best practices or expert opinion or not, and then try to investigate why it is that. And then you basically, I think you do interviews with some sample of the ones that you've surveyed, and try to figure out, like, is it because is people making who's making decisions? How are they making decisions? What are the incentives that drive them to make the decisions they are? The questions you ask are exactly the right questions. We'd have to go in and sort of figure it out.
So I love what you're saying, and one of the reasons that we are working to set up this interdisciplinary working group is to encourage people to find one another, to build on these sorts of things, to investigate them, to create a space for talking through the challenges that we're facing. And so, just in the interests of time, I want to say that we are looking forward to our meeting next month. It is during RSA. We're going to send out the invite sooner. If we hear from a lot of people that the RSA conference is going to occupy most of the participants, we'll skip April, come back in May. If you have content that you'd like to share, get some feedback, find some collaborators, we really want to enable that. It doesn't have to be fully done, published research. And so, thank you all for coming. I'm glad we had a good conversation, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a great day.